This video is going to talk about public goods. This is a topic from chapter 7. And what we're really going to do is introduce a couple of characteristics of goods and to see how they are different. A public good is going to be a good that is non-excludable and non-rival. What we have to do here is going to try to explain through or step through what these two characteristics of a good happen to be. Most goods out there are excludable and rival, and so we'll call them private goods. But so we haven't made this distinction yet. So basically, all goods that we've been talking about up till now are private goods because they are excludable and rival. So you're going to talk about this by talk about explaining what each of these things are by going the opposite. So a good is non-rival or non-excludable if it's difficult or impossible to keep non-payers from consuming the good. A good is excludable if you can easily or readily keep people who haven't paid from consuming a good. Now, the excludable part seems pretty straightforward because most all goods that you're aware of are excludable. Now, so what does it mean to be non-excludable? Well, okay, it's excludable if you go to the store, you go to Walmart, and you don't if you don't pay for the goods that you put in your basket, they don't allow you to leave the store with them. So those retail goods are excludable. There are some goods, though, that it's hard to think of excluding the non-payers from benefiting from them. And so think of an example like, say, a lighthouse. I guess they don't use lighthouses much anymore, but a lighthouse would be a prototypical example of a non-excludable good. The point being that you'd have that light in the lighthouse that would be along a rocky coast, and when ships that are passing by see the light of the lighthouse, they know to stay away from that because that's where the coast is, and in bad weather they might not be able to see it. And so the lighthouse keeps a ship off the rocky coast. Well, suppose two ships happen to be going by, and the beam of light from the lighthouse is on. If that beam of light from the lighthouse is on, and one of those ships has paid for the lighthouse services, but the other hasn't, if the beam of light is on, then it's going to be on for both ships. And the one that hasn't paid can still see the beam of light and know where to keep away from the coast. So that's when we started to think about, like, well, how are you going to keep somebody, if the lighthouse is on, how do you keep somebody who hasn't paid for that lighthouse from getting it? And that's what we mean by non-excludable. It's not very easy to come up with any way to keep people who haven't paid for the good from consuming it. Think of also like national defense. If a nation has a strong enough military to keep other adversaries from attacking it, then everybody who lives in that nation benefits from that, whether they happen to be one of the people who paid for the defense or not. Everybody benefits, and it's hard in that case to think, well, how are you going to only protect the people of the country who paid for this defense, and say, we could say to invaders, like, okay, you can come in and ravage our country, but only these people here, only these houses, because they haven't paid for their national defense. Everybody else, you can't touch their property. Well, that kind of thing doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. So there are some goods where we say it's non-excludable. It's very difficult to keep, maybe even impossible, to keep people who haven't paid for the good from consuming it. The other thing is non-rival. Most goods are rival. Most goods are rival in that if I eat a slice of pizza, you can't eat a slice of pizza. Only one of us can consume a good. And non-rival here says that one person's consumption does not interfere with or prevent another person's consumption of the same unit. You can share a pizza, but each slice somebody's going to eat. And when you get down to that last slice of pizza, as we all know, only one person gets to eat the last slice. And so that's a case where each slice of the pizza can be consumed by only one person. Another way to think about non-rivalness is that joint consumption. Two or more people can consume the same unit of the good. That might seem very odd, very unfamiliar to you. But again, let's consider that lighthouse example. If the beam of light from the lighthouse is on, As one ship passes the rocky point, it's still there. That same beam of light can be consumed by the second ship or a third ship that goes by. It's not like the first ship that goes by uses up the light and there is no light left over to keep a second ship off the rocks. Another way of thinking about non-rivalness is that if a good is non-rival, if it's truly non-rival, the cost of letting one more person consume the good once the good is provided is zero. So once you have that lighthouse built, there's a cost to building the lighthouse and operating it. But once it's built and operating, there's no additional cost with having to have with a second or third ship coming by during the same time that lighthouse is on. By contrast, if you want to make a second hamburger, the second hamburger also costs essentially the same amount to make as the first hamburger. So each hamburger that you make requires resources. To provide one more person with a hamburger, we have to cook an extra hamburger. And so the marginal cost of letting one more person have a hamburger is not zero. You need an extra hamburger to give a hamburger to an extra consumer. So that's non-rival and non-excludable. If a good happens to have both of these characteristics, then we'll call it a public good. Now, we use that term in economics. We're going to use that term public good specifically for goods that have these two characteristics. It might be possible to confuse a public good with something that would be provided to the public by the government. Everything that the government provides is not necessarily a public good. On the other hand, some public goods aren't always provided by the government. If something's a public good, there's a strong argument to have the government provide it, but it's not necessarily the case. And in terms of giving you a question on something like this, it's a very good wrong answer to give you would be to give you some good that's provided by the government but is not a public good as a wrong answer for a question. So for instance, consider like mail delivery by the Postal Service. Mail delivery is certainly, it's not non-excludable, it's excludable. If you don't put a stamp on the mail, on a letter, the post office won't deliver it. So it's excludable, and you can exclude non-payers at pretty low cost. And it's also rival. Although a lot of envelopes, a lot of letters can fit in a mail carrier's bag or in one box of mail, the cost of shipping an additional letter is not zero. It has to be processed. There's only so much room in every sack or every box. And so as you add up more and more letters, then you need another plane or you need another truck. Or not all of the mail might even go out with a mail carrier on their route in a given day if they have just too much mail to deliver. So it's it's both excludable and rival, so it's definitely not a public good. So there's one a way to trip you up with a question. If you want to think about whether something's a public good or not, you have to analyze it in terms of these two characteristics. Is it non-excludable or excludable? Is it rival or non-rival? It has to have both non-rival and non-excludable to be a public good. Now, if goods are public goods, and particularly if they're non-excludable, you get into a problem what's known as the free rider problem. And that not surprisingly comes out of the whole notion of non-excludability. Businesses can operate because they are selling excludable goods. A McDonald's restaurant can know that if you want a Big Mac, you have to pay for it. If you don't pay for the Big Mac, then you don't get it. And that means they're willing to incur the cost of preparing a Big Mac, knowing that only people who are going to pay for it are going to get that Big Mac. So you can, if you're a business and you're selling an excludable good, you're willing to incur the cost to produce a good because you'll be able, you can only let people who want to buy it, and then that they will pay for it, and you will get the revenue that you need to cover your costs. Now, of course, there's always the danger if you open a restaurant, you might not have any customers. So that's not what we're talking about. But any customers who come in and buy food from you or want to get food from you, you can make them pay. And because a public good is non-excludable, it becomes difficult. Like, what's going to be your business model to collect revenue? Well, sometimes we do see some revenue get collected. Sometimes in an office, somebody might bring in donuts or bagels or coffee, and they have a little box or something out for people to leave contributions. Like, say, oh, if you take a bagel, put in 50 cents. And maybe sometimes people do that, but it's also not very reliable because, so sometimes people will contribute toward a public good, and they might make some donations. But the problem with free riding is that some people won't. And because of that non-excludability, some people will end up consuming the good and they won't pay for it. Just as like some people might take a donut and not put in 25 cents like they're supposed to. And when free riding becomes too prevalent, then you can't raise enough revenue to provide the good. Or if you do provide it, if you can raise some revenue, you can't provide the good in a large enough quantity to be efficient. So there's a strong presumption that if you are trying to rely on for-profit businesses to provide public goods, in many cases, the quantity of the public good that we'll see in equilibrium will be less than the efficient quantity. So there's a pretty strong presumption that there's some a market inefficiency, a market failure that arises with public goods. And then that provides a rationale because something like national defense is a public good. That provides what's known as a public goods rationale for government to say government should step in and use taxes to collect money through taxes and then pay for something like national defense or lighthouses or roads or whatever the public good might happen to be, on the grounds that if we relied strictly on markets or voluntary contributions, the amount of the good that we would see provided would be too small. And especially if it's something like national defense, if your military is too small, then your nation might get attacked and overrun. So that's the idea of public goods. We have a very specific meaning for that, as discussed in Chapter 7. And for questions for a quiz or exam in this class, remember, it always goes back to this specific meaning in terms of non-excludable and non-rival. So that's public goods.